Please welcome your moderator, John Lenczowski, Marek Chodakiewicz, Msgr Slawomir Oder, and Minister Piotr Naimski.
Good morning once again, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to introduce to you my colleague at the Institute of World Politics, Dr. Marek Chodakiewicz, who, in my estimation, is one of the most productive scholars.
We always have a love fest. I love him. He's a Lord and Master. So, yeah.
Marek is one of the most productive scholars on the whole subject of Central and Eastern European history and the history of Western civilization. And then, of course, I'm delighted to introduce Msgr Slawomir Oder, who has been involved as the principal postulator for the case of the canonization of Pope John Paul, the Saint Pope John Paul II, and then again, we're delighted to have Minister Naimski with us. This panel is entitled Be Not Afraid, and it addresses the whole question of how the peoples of the Soviet Empire, of Poland, of East Central Europe, and the inner empire, even within the Soviet Union, managed to gain their courage in the face of the repressive atmosphere of that type of a political system. And I'd just like to begin by observing that the communist governments were all illegitimate governments. None of them ruled with the consent of the governed. They all seized power by conspiracy, force, ruthlessness, deception, and incremental seizure of power, the progressive destruction of the traditional institutions of society, the subversion of those institutions by all sorts of means, not the least of which was the promotion of sexual libertinism in order to break down the family, in order to break down the stability of social relationships. And of course, once they seized power, then there was, in the particular example that I gave, there was the reimposition of sexual puritanism in order to ensure the stability of society. But the central fact of political life in this type of a political system was the regime's fear of its own people. And that fear, the degree to which the regime feared the people, could be measured by the size of the internal security and then the scope of the internal security system of the state, which included not only in the pervasive use of informants. In East Germany, we do know the statistics. A full 25% of the East German population had been forced or co-opted into becoming secret informants to the secret police. God knows what that percentage was in Poland or the Soviet Union, but it was a pervasive thing. Then, of course, there are the many punishments for those who did not conform with the party line. There was the complete control of the economy, of job placement, of where you could reside. Inside the Soviet Union itself, you couldn't travel easily virtually from one town to another without having about 5 different documents in order: an internal passport, your trade union card, your draft card, residency card, and these other types of things. The complete control of the complete state monopoly of communications and information, and not to mention control of education, entertainment, all publishing, the jamming of foreign broadcasts, the hermetic sealing of the borders, and so on. And so fear, so you had the regime fearing the people, and you had the people fearing the regime. So how is this vicious cycle broken? And I would like first to begin just to ask each of the participants here on the panel if they could share some of their reflections of how people could get the courage to go and demonstrate. I mean, in almost all of these communist countries, if you went out into the streets to demonstrate, you would be arrested and you'd be sent off to, you'd be in the Soviet Union, you'd be sent to the Gulag. In Poland, it might not have been quite as severe, but it certainly could have been severe depending upon your, how important the regime thought you were to the internal security threat that it faced. Perhaps, Marek, would you like to begin?
Okay. I was taught three main things at home. Number one, be brave, audacity. Number two, be free, that's liberty. And number three, stay true to your homeland, patriotism, nationalism. Suddenly, there arrived a figure of superhuman proportions who reinforced it publicly. That was John Paul II. He said, fear not, nie lękajcie się. He also said, Jesus is the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Hence, Christianity means liberty. You are liberated. And then the Pope never tired of repeating that he's the son of Poland. That's what shaped him, molded him. He was not ashamed of sovereignty. He invoked the Bible, the Old Testament, where it plainly says that at first there were tribes and sovereign nations, not the EU or the Soviet Union. That was extremely important. And then lo and behold, another giant showed up on my horizon, and I experienced him firsthand in America since 1982. Before, I admired him from afar, and he would say things like, it's morning again in America. That means he dared to hope for the best. Following the debacle in Vietnam, stagflation, all that pessimism, he brought a smile back to our faces. And secondly, he spoke with jokes about the evil empire. That was fabulous. Good and evil. And lastly, he admonished us to remember that freedom will only last one generation if the kids stop giving a damn about it. This was a powerful wave of reinforcement for what I learned at home. Now, this is important to remember that when one grew up under totalitarianism, none of this was taken for granted. In fact, almost everybody was scared. Almost everybody refused to talk to the grandkids or kids and convey the message of freedom, the message of patriotism, the message of bravery and the truth. Normal people were scared. When I was a kid, I was surprised. But my grandmother taught me that we were right and everybody else was the freak, when in fact the opposite was the truth. Fear was all-pervasive and permanent. And then, in June 1979, when I was in high school, my teacher said, in May 1979, my teacher said, don't go to welcome this priest from Rome that's coming. There's going to be a massacre. People will stampede, kill each other, like in Mexico. And I raised my hand and I said, well, this is communist propaganda. I know that because one of Piotr Naimski's friends stole a communist propaganda memo and disseminated it within the dissident circles, which included my father. So we discussed it at home openly. And I thought I'd inform my teacher in case if she didn't know. Yes, I was 17. Boys are stupid, but nothing bad had happened to me personally. I'm the only male member in my family not yet to have died on the battlefield or to have been in a camp or in jail, except to visit my father. So I was not scared, but most people were. However, we all cut school to see the Pope. And we went to the Old Town first to see Papa Bill, his vehicle, his convoy. And I looked around. There were people looking at each other and smiling. You know the Brezhnev scowl? That was the default in communist countries because there was nothing to be happy about. Unless you scored that roll of toilet paper. Yeah, but that only would put a brief smile on your face. There in the Old Town and at the square, people were smiling. I thought I was back in the West. Not only that, people were not pushing. They were extremely well-mannered and self-policing. This was just a fabulous experience for what was only limited to a handful of crazy souls. The Pope managed to project onto virtually the entire nation. It's unbelievable. It didn't last forever. For instance, stupid me, I returned to Poland in 1980. I turned 18 in England in July. There were strikes in Poland in August 1980. So I thought there would be an anti-communist uprising. We'd fight the Soviets. Boys are stupid again. And then it was boring because solidarity mostly consisted of talking about things that my grandmothers had taught me about before. Why would I have to repeat that all the time? This is for the first time that because of the spirit of freedom, the people in Poland could speak openly. Then martial law was imposed. In February 1982, I was leafleting on a bus in between bus stops. People were scared, and none of them would take my leaflet from me, anti-communist leaflets. So I scorned them. Because I was stupid. I didn't realize that they thought I was a secret police provocator. This is what communism does to you. However, the driver of the bus not only accepted a couple of leaflets, but he also safely dropped me off before any scheduled stop, so nothing would happen to me. That means the seed had been planted, and people like the bus driver and others were the backbone of Solidarity and Independent Students' Union underground. Yes. Then Ronald Reagan got me out of Poland, and I heard the same message in a free country. I was frankly surprised that usually me, in college in California, I shuffled between Berkeley and Stanford. I went to college at San Mateo, San Francisco State. I didn't like people burning the American flag. There were a few other students who didn't, but they didn't say anything. And I said to them, dudes, fear not. What the heck is your problem? They are the freaks, the ones burning the flag, not us. Respect is a must for the country. And so it went on. Anyway, that's a short version.
Excellent. Gentlemen? May I ask your reflections on
If I may, I would like to recall my personal experience that I was living in the days. I was 18 when the Pope was elected, so I was in the moment of my life choices. I was thinking about the seminary. Well, Marek said about the atmosphere of fear that we were living before the election of Pope John II. And I can say that it was true. That was this atmosphere of scare, of being scared, of afraid. But I was living, it was before the famous words of John Paul II, "Be not afraid." I was living a moment of scare, and I was afraid when he was elected, because the enthusiasm that we were living in Poland at that moment so great that I was afraid to challenge all my life in the response to Christ for my vocation and to become priest. So I decided not to enter the seminary after the election of John Paul II, but to enter at university and just to make clear with my ideas. And I think that, well, it is something probably that can be read also in the general way, because in the moment of the election of John Paul II, I think at the beginning, when we were grown up in the fear and no hope atmosphere, we were afraid to have hope, because unexpectedly the hope opened behind us, and it was something unexpected. The hope. Well, John Paul II is called the witness to hope. And I think it is really the true name of him and his pontificate. I remember very well the moment when the Pope was arriving to Poland for the first time in 1979. Well, the symbol of this moment of the arrival was this burning with bells of the churches. You remember, of course. It was in all Poland, and the moment when the Pope was arriving, all bells in the church were belling. Yes, so it is something beautiful. But the most beautiful moment for me personally was just the mass that was celebrated, and we saw this part of the homily of the John Paul II in the Victory Square in Warsaw, when he said, when he invoked the Holy Spirit for us. It was the moment of charisma for Poland. But I think that in this moment, staying there, we could realize something that was really against the intentions of the regime. We could realize that we were a lot. There was a crowd, united by the same ideas, united by the same faith, and from this moment, by the same hope. And it was the moment really when you could find and feel the moment of borning of the new people, of new society. The hope entered in our hearts and our houses. And I think that this was the moment of the beginning of the true change in Poland. Well, John Paul II was a free man. He lived the liberty. And he said, what is the secret of the liberty? He said that a man who lives under the eyes of God is a free man. Have nothing to scare, to afraid. And, well, this moment, the Mass in the Victory Square, this moment when he invoked the Holy Spirit was the moment in which we could hear that we were living under the eyes of God, the moment of the hope and the burning of liberty, I think.
This is wonderful. This is, I just wanted to reflect on the significance of what you've just said here. one of the key elements of totalitarian government is to create the atomization of society, where you separate all people from every individual from the rest of society, so that the individual stands alone against the all-powerful state. And so long as the individual is, and this is done, of course, by creating this pervasive atmosphere of fear and mistrust, where nobody can trust anybody else, such as you were commenting, Marek, the people couldn't trust you, thinking you were a provocateur with your leaflets. And of course, there were all sorts of maneuvers that the secret police did along these lines. And so when people are isolated this way, it brings them into a psychological state of futile resignation, where the regime is basically telling you resistance to us is futile. And so the strategic challenge is to get people to escape somehow this psychological state of despair. And you are saying effectively that when the Pope was there, gave you a message of hope, and when you saw that you were all in the big crowd and that there is more of us than there is of them, that this somehow snapped this period of atomization and mass fear. It was really a moment that this happened. Could you see it creeping? Could you see this thing happening incrementally, or did it somehow snap?
You see, I can say I completely agree. You know that the major was a question of losing hope, being hopeless, and I completely agree with Father. He brought hope again. Many impossibilities we had that time. So impossible happened to be the reality after his election, because of his election. Nobody expected in Poland and all over the world that something like that could happen, and it happens. So once his election happened, all right, also Poland could be free, could be free country. And you see, they were number of us, not great number of us, before he came to Poland. Probably I agree with Marek, being stupid enough not to be afraid.
Yeah, that's it.
Or too young to be afraid, which is also, you know, I can tell you when we started, I mean, me and my friends, we started this opposition to communist regime in Poland in early 70s, or when we organized this committee in support of workers after the riots in 76, we are persuaded by our parents and also grandparents who still remembered, you know, the experience of Second World War and after the war and 56 riots in Poland and in 70, that, you know, it could be really futile, and we shouldn't do it what we wanted to start, because we would be, you know, exiled or jailed or killed, or and they were afraid, scared about losing next young generation of Poles. So I remember that when I was, you know, being 20-something, you know, years old, I was approaching, you know, those heroes from Second World War, because they were still alive. We knew them. And I wanted them to persuade to join us. And many of them, they were quite reluctant to do it because they were scared about us. Some of them did. And once this visit happened, all of that really changed. And this is why Solidarity was able to rise in 3 months, as I mentioned before. It took really 3 months. Late August, September, October, and half of November to have this organization alive, which is quite it was something really, really, once again, miraculous. All right, let me raise another point. His visit, John Paul II visit, gave us or brought back the sense of being part of the free world, being part of something wider, being part of the, of course, Catholic Church, but also being part of the West. This is what is really important. At that time, it was Cold War going on, and it was the West and communists, and we felt ourselves being already part of the West, which was really important. And one point more. I can imagine that John Paul II saying, "Be not afraid," he could address communist apparatchiks as well. Be not afraid of your nation. And I think that knowing his Pope's other addresses and what he was saying, in many times, I think that he treated all of his interlocutors same way as human beings. So not be afraid.
That's wonderful. I would like to ask about one thing, because we're talking here about overcoming fear, gaining courage in the context of the complete sort of moral Chernobyl, in a way, that the communist world was subjected to. And I would like to ask your reflections about the moral psychological condition of the people in light of Václav Havel's observation that most people living inside the communist world had been forced in one way or another to compromise, had been forced by the regime to go along with the party line in one way or another. If you went to work in your office or your factory, and particularly more so in the Soviet Union, but the propagandist agitator would show up once a week to give you the latest party line and would say, "Oh, well, our government has decided now to render fraternal assistance to our brothers in Afghanistan in order to fight Chinese and American interventionism. How many of you here agree with this policy and support the policy?" And of course, everyone has to raise their hand. And anyone who doesn't raise their hand, well, their daughter won't get into the university, their heat quota may be lowered for the winter, or some other kind of punishment. And so once you raise your hand, now you're all of a sudden a moral accomplice to the policy. And this has an incredibly morally corroding effect upon your spirit, and because now you've become an accessory to the whole business. And maybe you were even forced to be an informant against your will. And so In light of this type of a psychology where people, so many people had to become morally compromised in order to sacrifice perhaps their own integrity for the sake of their children, let's say, how do you overcome this? How do you escape this? What is this? What is the psychological moral mechanism that occurred here? Because something happened.
What I saw in the adult world, in my family, was belief in free will. So free will dictates that you don't have to become a swine. They won't promote you. They'll cut your heat or lower your meat quota, and you don't have to be a swine. Yes, I'm an absolutist. I was taught, let your communications be nay, nay, yay, yay, whether it was Poland or now the United States, where we need it because of the wave of political correctness. At the same time, I'm a historian, so I study accommodation. Accommodation is the rule among all human beings, not only captive people, but we all agree. I remember Ambassador Bob Riley wrote a book, Closing of the Muslim Mind, and he wrote another one, Making Gay Okay. And some people would say, oh my goodness, you're so accomplished. Why did you have to write about such controversial topics? Well, that's because hardly anybody else does, except Paul Kanger maybe. It's a moral choice that you speak on topics that the glitterati try to blackmail you to be silent about. And there was no difference when I observed the adults who lived around me. My parents, my grandmothers, they made choices. And they lived in crap. They lived abysmal lives, and they could have lived much better. All they had to do was lie, cheat, steal, and join the Communist Party. They never surrendered, and they paid enormous prices. My grandmother, who had been a veteran of the Home Army, who survived the Gestapo, the NKVD, Soviet secret police, and the Polish Communist secret police, would not join the official veterans, communist-run veterans organization, which means she had no privileges at the hospital. She had to pay full price for everything, not only healthcare, but also a state-run phone company. You wouldn't give her a break on her bill. And we were all impoverished because of World War II and its aftermath. Those were moral choices. And I'm very proud of my family. Now I understand that we were freaks. Because most people, even some of her commanding officers would say, well, don't worry, sign some documents. You don't have to be a communist, but if you belong to this organization, your life will be easier. And by the way, keep quiet.
That's right. Father?
Well, I think that the problem you mentioned, of course, existed, but it is impossible to say that the majority of the society collaborated or make some choices against the morality. Well, Mark...
Accommodated, yes. They accommodated. That's not the same as collaboration.
Yes.
There's resistance, there's accommodation, and there's collaboration, willing collusion with evil. Very few did that.
Yeah.
Most simply wanted to survive.
Yes, just survive. But it was not simple to survive. I think that in that time, and I remember it perfectly from my experience, we had at least two spheres in which the liberty existed. It means the church. In the church, we all the time were free. And it was possible to say, also paying personally, as we remember, for example, the Father Popiełuszko, his example, he paid with his life. But it was possible to say the truth, and we felt free. Yeah. It was possible because of the presence of such bishops such figures like Cardinal Wyszyński, like
Yes.
Cardinal Wojtyła. So it was one sphere of the liberty. And another one, of course, it was up to the personal situation, but it was family. And the family we lived, yes, the memory of the freedom, the memory and the concrete situation of moral truths in our choices and our memory. I remember, of course, in the school, at the time I was a student, I was studying, and the history was something, history, not only history, literature. Well, it was the subject that was discussed and was possible to present it in different ways. And I remember after lessons at school, I was returning to home, and my father or my grandfather asked me, what was the school about? And I said, for example, about World War II. Well, and what the teacher said? He said this and this. Well, he said this, but you must remember that it was this way. So we have, I remember this moment just like a schizophrenic situation. We lived in the parallel worlds. It was the official world and was normal family world. It was translated in, also in our common language. At that time in Poland, we used to say they and we. When we were talking about the state of the government, they were, and we. Another situation. Really, the communism, the communist state was felt by the society like something strange.
Alien. No.
Yes, it was. It doesn't. It was not a part of our legacy, of our way, of our life. It was something strange, momentary. Well, this moment would be long or short, but it was something that doesn't make part of our life. So I think this two situations: the church and the family, with the memory of their freedom and the truth and morality, it is something that helps us to live.
And private agriculture, the
Of course.
farmers illegally fed
Yes.
the cities.
Of course, yes, that's true.
Yes, that's what made Poland different. Private
You see,
property.
what Father and Marek described, it was it was a real fact of kind of a double reality, living in double reality, which wasn't easy, and it depended on individual character, where was the border between those realities. And but you see, the border between collaboration and the rest, of course, existed. Asking this question, John, you touched the problem of decommunization in post-communist countries and revealing of secret informants and so on and so on. And those who were against such moves, which I personally, I thought that they were necessary. They argued against that, saying that, all right, everybody has been involved and we are all responsible. So what is the reason, to go to the past? Let's think about the future. There is no future without past and without responsibility for the past. So I believe, that I really think that this moral border, between those who collaborated, not necessarily being secret informant, but, for example, simply being, communist apparatchiks, people like that. So they were responsible, and we should think about their responsibility. The problem is sometimes deeper because you see, it touches Marek touched this side of the issue. It touches these days political correctness, because people are afraid. Today, people are very often afraid to stand and say what they think about certain issues. They are afraid of their colleagues, they are afraid of their superiors. They are not, there is no communist, there is no police regime, but there is something which is imposed upon us. And this is why what I tried, to touch in my speech, 1 hour ago.
Yes. Political correctness is really an outgrowth of the Leninist doctrine of adopting the correct ideology and maintaining conformity with it. It was the vehicle of thought control and speech control, which would then be the vehicle to ensure party discipline and the conformity with the party line, so that in the first case, the minority could seize power over the majority, and then later that same minority could rule.
In fact, Lenin coined the term.
Excuse me?
Lenin coined the term.
Yes.
Political correctness.
Yes.
It's not politically correct, comrades. Follow me.
Now, I would just like to ask one question that could be and may, in some respects, not be related to all of this, but I would like to have particular Monsignor's reflections of why Pope John Paul II was made a saint.
It is very hard to explain in the few
but
minutes.
It's really, necessary. You should.
Yes.
It's very simple. He made impossible things possible. That's called a miracle.
Well, no, the truth that the church has a very, very hard and rigid rules, legal rules regarding the process of sainthood. Of course, the process of St. John Paul II was as a process about the virtues, heretical virtues of his life. And I can say that really he lived all his life making the choices that were very, very hard and sometimes impossible, humanly impossible, but it was possible because he was just a man of God. And I think that the secret of St. John Paul II was just that he was a man of God. It means that he lived his dialogue, the presence of God in his life. His life was open to the meta-historical dimension. And I think that, the message that he gave us was just this one: not limit our life to the temporary, historical, social, political analysis, but it is necessary to open our life just to the presence of somebody and something else. And it is possible so, in this way, to change what is humanly impossible. John Paul II was the man of faith, was the man of truth, was the man of hope, but essentially he was a man of God. So that is why he is sent.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Monsignor. Gentlemen, thank you for your wonderful contributions.
Oh, good.